In the early 1970s, social psychologists studying attitude behavior consistency began documenting something unsettling in ordinary human interaction. Across multiple controlled observations, participants would express strong agreement with a statement, a decision, or a proposed action, only for their later behavior to show no alignment with what they had just affirmed. Not confusion, not misunderstanding. Agreement followed by inaction. The pattern repeated so consistently that it became a cornerstone in the study of what researchers now call the attitude-behavior gap. What people say they will do and what they actually do exists as two partially disconnected systems. And the most disturbing part was this: the verbal agreement was often sincere. So the question becomes uncomfortable in its simplicity. If agreement does not reliably produce action, what exactly are you hearing when someone says yes? This phenomenon is best understood through a convergence of three psychological mechanisms: commitment without encoding, social compliance pressure, and identity signaling. Robert Cialdini's work on influence shows that verbal commitment often creates the illusion of behavioral probability. Once a person agrees, both they and the observer assume an internal shift has occurred. But intention, as Daniel Kahneman's dual process model suggests, is not the same as execution. System 1 can generate immediate agreement. System 2 is required for follow-through, and it is far more fragile. By the end of this analysis, you will be able to distinguish between three things that are normally indistinguishable in conversation: genuine behavioral intent, social agreement for friction reduction, and identity-based signaling that has no executional depth. You will also recognize why the most confident yes is often the least reliable predictor of action. Not because people are deceptive, but because agreement is psychologically cheaper than implementation. Most agreements in daily life are not commitments. They are social stabilizers. In ordinary conversation, when someone proposes an idea, there is a subtle pressure to reduce friction. Saying yes ends the discomfort of potential conflict. Saying no extends it, so the brain selects the path of least resistance. This is not conscious manipulation. It is conversational efficiency. The human nervous system treats disagreement as a micro-social threat. Even mild contradiction can trigger measurable increases in cognitive load, which the brain naturally seeks to minimize. This is why people agree in meetings, casual plans, and even serious discussions without any internal plan to execute the behavior. To detect this layer in real life, observe what happens after agreement. If the conversation immediately shifts away from logistics, when, how, under what constraints, then what you received was not commitment. It was social smoothing. A true commitment contracts into detail, a false one dissolves into abstraction, and beneath this, another mechanism begins to operate: the assumption that agreement itself has already done the work, which leads directly into the second layer. Once a person says yes, something subtle happens in memory encoding. The brain begins to treat the intention as partially completed. Peter Gollwitzer's research on implementation intentions shows that without explicit if-then structures, goals remain abstract mental objects rather than executable plans. But in everyday life, people rarely convert agreement into structure. They leave it as an unanchored intention. So the mind fills the gap with illusion. The agreement feels like progress. This is where cognitive miscalibration occurs. The brain confuses cognitive completion, thinking about doing, with behavioral completion, doing. This creates what looks like reliability in the moment and failure in execution later. You can detect this by a simple diagnostic. Ask whether the person has specified friction points: time, place, sequence, dependency. If none exist, the agreement is still floating in abstract space. And abstract intentions decay quickly. But there is a deeper reason they do not convert into action, one that involves the social environment itself. When agreement happens in a social context, responsibility becomes diluted. If multiple people are involved in an idea, each individual subconsciously assumes that execution responsibility is shared. This is a variation of the bystander effect, where responsibility decreases as perceived group involvement increases. But even in one-on-one interactions, diffusion still occurs. The mere presence of another person reduces internal ownership of the outcome. The mind subtly reframes the commitment from "I will do this" to "this will be done." The grammatical shift from first person to passive construction is one of the most reliable predictors of non-execution. This is where many misunderstandings originate. The speaker believes they have secured cooperation. The other person believes they have expressed openness. Neither has internalized sole responsibility, and so nothing anchors. But this is not the final layer, because something even more paradoxical appears when people are highly motivated. But here is where it becomes more complex. High motivation does not eliminate this gap. In some cases, it intensifies it. Research in behavioral psychology shows that verbalizing intentions can produce a premature sense of completion. The mind experiences a micro-release of reward circuitry simply by stating the plan. Dopamine anticipates closure that has not occurred yet, so the declaration becomes a substitute for action. In other words, saying it out loud can reduce the urgency to do it. This is the intention illusion effect. Verbal commitment temporarily satisfies the psychological tension that action is meant to resolve. This is why people often feel productive after agreeing to something, even when no behavior has changed. And this leads to a more uncomfortable realization. Agreement can actively interfere with execution, not just fail to produce it. From here, the structure of behavior shifts again. At a deeper level, agreement often functions as identity maintenance. People do not only say yes to actions, they say yes to preserving how they want to be perceived. Agreeing signals traits: cooperative, competent, supportive, ambitious. These are identity markers. And identity signaling does not require follow-through, only recognition. This is where signaling theory becomes relevant. In social systems, the appearance of alignment often carries immediate social reward, while actual execution carries delayed and uncertain cost. So the brain optimizes for recognition, not completion. If a behavior improves social perception instantly but delays personal cost, the human mind will disproportionately favor the immediate signal over the delayed obligation. This is why people can repeatedly agree to tasks that never materialize. The agreement itself has already served its social function. To detect this layer, observe emotional response after agreement. If there is visible relief or satisfaction without corresponding planning behavior, identity signaling has likely replaced execution intent. But even this is not the final mechanism. There is still friction to consider. Human cognition is biased toward the present. Temporal discounting ensures that future effort is psychologically undervalued compared to immediate comfort. So when someone agrees to a task that exists in the future, the brain does not experience the full weight of that future cost. It assigns it a lower value than it deserves. This creates a distortion. Future action feels easier in imagination than it will feel in reality. Add friction, time, uncertainty, inconvenience, and the gap widens further. So agreement becomes a form of deferred confrontation with difficulty. And most people avoid confronting difficulty twice. They do it once, in language, and then attempt to avoid it again in reality. This is why intentions collapse under the smallest resistance. They were never calibrated against real friction in the first place. And once friction appears, the original agreement loses structural support. The system fails quietly. No rejection, no refusal, just disappearance. If these mechanisms operate consistently, then agreement cannot be treated as evidence of intent. It becomes evidence of something more unstable. A temporary alignment between social pressure, identity management, and cognitive efficiency. This means the people around you are not necessarily unreliable in a moral sense. They are predictable within a system where speech is cheap and execution is expensive, but the implication turns inward as well, because the same mechanisms apply when you say yes, to plans, to habits, to decisions that feel real in the moment but dissolve under friction later. The unsettling realization is not that people fail to act on their words. It is that the mind is structured in a way that makes verbal certainty one of the least reliable predictors of future behavior, across all individuals, including the one making the observation. Now that the mechanism is visible, the signal can be decoded. First tool, require implementation specificity. If agreement does not immediately convert into time, location, and sequence, it remains psychological noise. force structure or treat it as non-commitment. Second tool, separate agreement from identity. When someone says yes, do not register it as alignment. Register it as intent in theory. Only actions convert identity into reliability. Third tool, introduce friction awareness. Ask what obstacle will prevent execution before assuming execution will occur. The quality of the answer predicts the reality of follow-through more accurately than the agreement itself. And finally, observe the silence after agreement. If nothing changes in planning, ownership, or urgency, the commitment was never transferred into behavior. It remained at the level of language. The broader pattern is simple. Humans are far more consistent in what they express than in what they execute. And once that is understood, agreement stops being the end point of communication and becomes only the beginning of verification. The next layer of this subject is not about why people fail to act, but about why some environments make action inevitable while others dissolve even the strongest intentions.